Okay, so now I'm going to talk about stem changers. Just like in the present tense and the preterit tense, you have stem changing verbs. There are only two types, though, in the preterit. There are verbs that change from, oops, wrong thing. There are verbs that change from an E to I in their stem, and there are verbs that change to an O to a U in their stem. And the stem is the part of the verb that comes before the ending. So like for pedir, the ending is IR, so its stem is PED. For dormir, the ORM comes before the IR, so that's its stem. And the stem change in the preterite tense, you have to be careful because even if it is the same verb that has a stem change in the present tense, which these guys do have a change in the present tense, the way they change is different in the preterite. They only change in third person or second person plural, second person formal. So they change here and they change in the plural form. Only for third person, unlike in the present tense where the change happened everywhere but nosotros and vosotros. You're going to make changes for usted, él, ella, and ustedes, ellos, ellas. And all you're going to do is change, for example, here's pedir, you just change the E to an I before you add the appropriate ending, or the O to a U before you add the appropriate ending, okay? So let's do a little bit of practice. Okay, so this is our practice. Ayer en el restaurante, Roberto dormir pedir una sopa. Makes more sense that he's asking for soup, which would be pedir. Okay. Who's doing the asking of this soup? That is going to be Roberto. He's our subject, and he's the same thing as él. That's how you know how to use our chart and conjugate. So if I put in pedir, I'm going to get rid of my ending, and since the ending that I'm going to add, because it's for he, is the IO ending, the third person ending, I have to change that E in my stem to an I, because this is third person. So my answer is, ayer en el restaurante Roberto pidió una sopa. El camarero nos servía repetir la sopa antes de servirnos la ensalada. Here it makes most sense that he's going to serve us. Servir. And who's doing the serving? It's the waiter. Okay, so be careful here because nos is to whom something is being served. You don't conjugate for those guys. These guys or proper nouns are who you're conjugating for. Okay, these guys are something else. So it's the waiter who's doing the serving to us. Okay, so I put in servir. Now, is servir let me go back. So if el camarero is doing the serving, that's the same thing as he, which would be third person again. Okay, so if what I'm going to add for he is the IO, okay, then we go down here. Servir is one of our preterites, and the way they've got this chart set up is to the left-hand side. That's how they change in the present tense. To the right-hand side is how they change in the preterite tense. So servir is an E to I. This is in the third person form because it's él. So what I need to do is change that E in my stem to an I. Sirvió, el camarero nos sirvió la sopa antes de servirnos la ensalada. Yo repetir dormir 8 horas anoche. I'm going to plug in dormir. Makes more sense that I slept rather than I repeated 8 hours. Who's doing this sleeping? I am. Okay, and if it's I'm going to take off the ending. The ending that I add for I is an I. And I don't need to do anything to my O because this is for first person, not third person. I would only change that O to a U if the person who had been doing the sleeping was usted, él, or ella, etc. Okay, Let's do this one down here and then I'm gonna move on. Mis hijos dormir, preferir toda la noche. This again is dormir, and that's why I picked this one. Okay, and this time, who's doing the sleeping? It's gonna be my kids, which is the same thing as ellos. Okay, so when I take my IR off, what I would be adding for ellos, if it's an IR verb, is I-E-R-O-N. Okay, and because this is third person, it's ellos, I'm going to have to change my O in the stem to a U. Durmieron. Okay, two more sets of irregulars we're going to talk about. And for these guys, you're just going to have to memorize how they're spelled. They're not stem changers, they're just completely irregular, and you'll recognize some of them because they're also irregular in the present tense. So, ser and ir have the same forms in the preterite, and it's the context of the sentence that will clarify the meaning. So it says, sabes, nuestros abuelos también, sabes, nuestros abuelos también fueron jóvenes. And that would be they, you know, our grandparents were also young. And then fuimos a dar un paseo al centro. We went for a walk downtown, or we went downtown for a walk. So it's the context that lets you know whether or not it's ir or ser. Then estar and tener have the same irregularities in the preterite, so their beginnings are different. You know, you have est versus just t, but if you can do one, you can do the other. They're spelled pretty much the same. And dar and ver, they have the exact same endings, and they end up using even though dar is an AR verb, it basically has IR endings throughout. Okay, so let's just go through and practice them. Ser and ir would be fui, fuiste, fue, fuimos, fuistes, fueron. Estar es estuve, estuviste, estuvo, estuvimos, estuvisteis, estuvieron. Tener es tuve, tuviste, tuvo, tuvimos, tuvisteis, tuvieron. Dar es di, diste, dio, dimos, disteis, dieron. And ver is vi, viste, vio, vimos, visteis, vieron. And haber, I changes to hubo. And so let's, okay, so we'll go through and do a little bit of practice with each of these. I won't do the whole thing because I want to go through practice with all of them. This one is with ir or ser. Okay, el año pasado yo blank a España para estudiar español. I went to Spain, which in this case it's going to be ir. Who's doing the going? It is I. And so I for ir is going to be fui. Let me just erase that. Fui. Los chicos blank un partido de fútbol con sus amigos. Again, that's going to be went. That's going to be ir. They went to a football game with their friends. Who went? That would be los chicos, which is the same thing as ellos. Which ir for ellos, if I go down here, it would be fueron. Okay, Ronald Reagan, blank, presidente de los Estados Unidos por 8 años. That would be was, Ronald Reagan was, so that would be ser. Who was that president? It would be Ronald Reagan, which is the same thing as he. Which if I put ser in there and I do ser for he, it would be fue. Okay, this time you're going to do practice with estar. Oops. Estar and tener. Okay, same thing. Mis amigos blank en Costa Rica el mes pasado. They were in Costa Rica, which would be estar. Who was in Costa Rica? That would be my friends, which is the same thing as saying ellos. And so estar for ellos, if you go down here, for ellos would be estuvieron. Okay. La profesora blank que salir de clase temprano ayer. La profesora had to leave class early yesterday, which would be tener. Who is it that had to leave? It would be la profesora, which is the same thing as ella. Oopsies, ella. Okay, so tener for ella would be tuvo. Okay, then la semana pasada mis padres played muchos problemas con su coche. They had a lot of problems, which would be tener. Who had those problems? That would be my parents or them. Ellos. And so tener for ellos, if I go down here, would be tuvieron. Okay, this time you gotta do dar or ver. Dar to give, ver to see. Mi madre blank, dar un paseo con su amiga. Oops, I went ahead and said it. Dar un paseo con su amiga ayer. So, dar un paseo is to go for a walk. So we have dar. Who's doing that walking? That would be mi madre, which is the same thing as ella. So dar for ella would be yo. Mis amigos y yo blank una película muy buena el viernes pasado. So that would probably be ver. We saw. Who did the seeing? Mis amigos y yo, which is the same thing as nosotros. Okay, which would be ver for nosotros would be vimos. Okay, and the last set of irregulars that we have are poder, poner, saber, venir, hacer, querer, decir, and traer. And so again, you're just gonna have to memorize their endings. Poder is pude, pudiste, pudo, pudimos, pudistes, pudieron, poner, puse, pusiste, puso, pusimos, pusisteis, pusieron, saber, supe, supiste, supo, supimos, supiste, supieron, venir, vine, viniste, vino, vinimos, vinisteis, vinieron, hacer, hice, hiciste, hizo, hicimos, hicisteis, hicieron, querer, quise, quisiste, quiso, quisimos, quisisteis, quisieron, decir, dije, dijiste, dijo, dijimos, dijisteis, dijeron, traer, traje, trajiste, trajo, trajimos, trajisteis, trajeron. Okay, so let's do a little bit of this practice. ¿Qué hacer venir ustedes la semana pasada? What did you guys do rather than came? I think would make the most sense. So you would put in hacer. This one's asking you a question. So you would actually find the subject of your sentence after your verb. So it's wanting to know, what did you all do? So for hacer, for you all, we go down to you all, we go across to hacer, we've got hicieron. ¿Qué hicieron ustedes la semana pasada? Julio, mi mejor amigo de México, venir, poder a visitarme, makes most sense that he came, not that he could visit, so that he came to visit me, which would be venir. Who is it that did the coming? Julio, which is the same thing as él. which would make this. If it's venir and it's él, we go down to él and across vino. Vino a visitarme. Julio me saber traer una pelota de fútbol. A pelota de fútbol is an actual football, like the ball, a soccer ball. So it's probably bringing, which is traer. And here you want to be careful because again, you've got me. Well, you'll notice that over here, you don't see me or nos or le. These are for whom you conjugate. This is how you need these or proper nouns to determine how you conjugate your verb. That me is your indirect object pronoun. That's to whom the ball was given. So Julio is actually the subject. He's the one who's doing the giving of the ball. He's for whom you conjugate.